This is California Edition. My name is Brad Pomerance. We are coming to you from the Cannon House office building in Washington, D.C. We are joined by Henry Waxman, member of the United States Congress. Sir, thank you so much for joining us. We appreciate it.
Thank you very much.
I want to speak with you about an issue that some may think is esoteric, but could impact many Californians and Americans, and that's the question of the sequester.
Yes.
A process whereby the federal deficit is decreasing, but at very rapid rates. What's your sense of the sequester?
Well, people thought of the sequestration when they talked about the bishops in Rome choosing the new pope.
Right.
They brought them all together and locked the doors. Maybe that's what they should do for Congress.
Oh my.
But the sequestration was an automatic meat-axe cut in appropriated money for the military and defense as well as domestic programs. It doesn't affect Medicare and Medicaid. Did Medicare to some extent, but a lesser extent.
But what's interesting is there was a sense that the sky was going to fall once sequestration hit, yet the markets don't seem to have reacted much on a day in and day out basis. Other than the air traffic controllers situation, it doesn't seem to have really impacted Americans. Is that of concern to you, given that it appears you would like to see the sequestration reversed?
The sequestration was set up to be so awful and so stupid that both Democrats and Republicans would reach an alternative agreement to avoid it. It's now in effect, and it is having an impact. We saw it with the air traffic controllers, but a lot of people are being told they have to go on furloughs, unpaid leave from their jobs. They have to pay their bills. Nobody's giving them a furlough from paying their obligations. And we're seeing that, and it's disruptive. A lot of the contractors, the military contractors in the South Bay area, in my district, are having a tough time trying to deal with this. And so it's a mindless idea to just say we're going to cut everything equally. There's some programs, if they're not worthwhile, we should eliminate them. But others, we ought to be sure we fund.
So the one thing I have heard from people out and about is that they're not so sure what the sequester does, but there's a little bit of frustration that the Congress, they'll fix the sequester as it relates to meat inspectors or air traffic controllers, but with regard to Head Start or jobless benefits, that won't be fixed.
That won't be fixed.
And so are you hearing the same thing from your district? Your constituents expressing that concern, that why is it you're fixing things that impact the wealthy, but you're not fixing the issues that impact those that are of lesser means?
Well, they impact the wealthy and the middle class as well. But we're not hearing a lot about from the people who suffer the most when they don't get government services, the daycare programs for kids, or the alternatives to nursing homes for elderly people. We don't hear about that.
Meals on Wheels.
Meals on Wheels, or we don't hear about the reductions in biomedical research funding. It makes no sense. Nobody would support that kind of a cut.
So where does the Congress go from here? There doesn't seem to be a lot of discussion about it. We hear a lot of discussions on immigration or gun control, but sequester, radio silence.
The issue is going to come up when we have to raise the debt ceiling again, which means pay the creditors from whom we borrowed money in order to keep the U.S. credit worthiness in the right track.
But for better or for worse, there are reports that suggest because the economy is doing better, because more tax revenue is coming in, that day could be pushed off all the way to October. So some could argue it's a blessing or a curse because the sequester discussion won't be resolved until then.
Well, sequestration is not just this year as bad as it is already. It's going to be next year and the year after unless we change it, and we'll be starting with cuts at a lower point after we've already taken cuts. And we are cutting very deeply into the bone, not the fat.
For our viewers on HLN, we thank you for joining us. For our other viewers, we'll be right back. Sir, I want to speak with you about health care reform. It is an issue that you have been passionate about for decades, literally. The Affordable Care Act is before us. In the state of California, we are adopting the exchange program. We are adopting the Medicaid expansion, as we know it, Medi-Cal. But there's still some nerves out there. Talk to me about what your constituents are saying to you about what's before us come 2014.
Well, I think there's some people are anxious about it because it's a brand new way of handling health care insurance for a large part of the population. Most people won't be affected if they have their insurance through their large employers, and their employer insurance will carry on and they won't go to the exchange. But if you have to buy a private policy, that's where you'll go. You go to the exchange.
What some people are saying is that, well, wait a second, I work part-time, I was working 30, 35 hours a week. My employer's cutting me to below 30 so they don't have to give me insurance. I'm getting laid off so my employer doesn't have to give me insurance. How do we address those issues? Because there's no doubt businesses are also nervous.
Yeah. Well, I think small businesses have a lot of concern what will happen to them. A lot of small businesses don't cover their employees. In this law, we're going to give them tax credits to help them do it. A lot of employers have less than 50 employees. They're not affected by this law, but those employees will be able, I call it exchange, it's really a marketplace.
Sure.
They're going to have different competing private insurance plans offered to them. Each one has to have at least a certain basic benefit. They'll be able to choose. California will run it. They call it Covered California.
That's right.
And I think a lot of people, especially those who have been discriminated against by insurance companies because they have pre-existing medical conditions, will have a chance to buy and have insurance to cover them and their families.
I mentioned that California is accepting the Medicaid expansion, Medi-Cal expansion. Part of the reason that California is willing to do that is there's 100% rebate or reimbursement from the feds. That goes down to 90% in a few years. That being said, Governor Brown of California has been very nervous that that reimbursement rate could drop, and he's looking to put in legislation that would reverse the acceptance of the expansion if it drops below 90%. What is the Congress doing to address the fears of even Democratic governors?
Well, that's
if anything.
The fears of governors is they're going to have to pay a large new expense for their Medi-Cal or Medicaid program in other states. And that's why we put in 100% funding for a number of years. It'll drop to 90%. It's still a good deal if 90% of the cost of giving health care to low-income people in your state is going to be covered by the federal government when we get there in a number of years, and maybe we can even extend the 100% funding beyond.
Do you see that happening, though? Going back to the 100% threshold?
Well, I could see a lot of changes in healthcare once we get this whole system in place. It's not perfect. We're going to learn from our experience, and I could foresee the law being changed in a few years in a lot of different ways. But there are people who will go on the Medicaid program. It'll serve their needs, and the states should be happy to have those people covered. And for most part, they're going to get a good deal from the federal government. 100% funding is the best deal you could possibly get.
I want to shift gears a bit and speak about what we've seen in California recently, which is a lot of fires popping out in California. We've seen tremendous dryness in our desert areas. Arguably, we're facing a drought. Our snowpack is lower than it's been in many, many years. What does that tell you about the future of our environment, at least specifically in California?
Well, California and the rest of the world are going through what we call climate change. There are pollutants that cover the whole planet, and it heats up the planet. And we see destruction of the snowpacks, the acidification of the oceans, more droughts, more severe storms. It's happening with enormous frequency.
At the same time, if we were speaking 5 years ago, I think it's fair to say that many of your colleagues, many Republicans, for example, were still quite skeptical about climate change. Do you feel as if that skepticism is on the wane? My perception is it seems to be on the wane, but that's just my perception.
Well, it's hard to avoid the reality and the evidence that we can see from so many different places of the planet heating up. And a lot of my colleagues have been skeptical because they're not sure it's the contribution from man-made contribution. But I think that's hard to hold on to as well. The prudent thing to do is, even if you don't buy the whole Al Gore message, is to take an insurance policy out. It's also good for our economy to start moving away from the fossil fuels of oil and coal and new renewable fuels and greater efficiency in the use of our energy. It'll help our economy, it'll help our environment.
To be continued. His name is Congressman Henry Waxman. My name is Brad Pomerance. This is California Edition.
In 2011, how many of the top 10 polluting nations experienced a decrease in CO2 emissions? 0, 1, 2, or 3? According to the National Climate Change Report, only the United States and Germany saw their CO2 emission levels drop in 2011.
This is California Edition. I'm Brad Pomerance. We are coming to you from the nation's capital, Washington, D.C. We're inside the Cannon House office building, and joining us today is Jerry McNerney. He is a member of the U.S. Congress representing the Delta. And I want to speak with you about the Delta. I've recently spoken with the Secretary of Natural Resources for the state of California, John Laird. He's a big proponent of what's known as the Bay Area Delta Conservation Plan. I know that 3 members of Congress, yourself, Mr. Garamendi, and one other whose name escapes me, has some real serious concerns about the conservation plan. Talk to us about it.
Well, actually, there's more than 3 that have a concern about it. Basically, there is the Bay is the most valuable estuary in the West Coast. In fact, the western United States, west of the Mississippi River, and it's a jewel. It has its own ecosystem. And it's a tremendous resource for the community. It's a tremendous resource for California and for the western part of the country.
No doubt. And the question is, when we look at the Delta, so much of California relies on the Delta. If the Delta became unusable for whatever reason, earthquake, whatever it may be, Southern California would be dry. 25 million individuals would be without water. And so what Mr. Brown is saying, the governor, is he wants to create these tunnels under the Delta to create increased water flow regardless of natural disaster. Tell us your concerns. I want to hear them.
Well, what the governor is proposing is 2 very large tunnels with a tremendous capacity to take water under the Delta to point south of the Delta. Now, if you look at the capacity that's being installed, it would be enough to divert the whole Sacramento River around the Delta. And the Sacramento River is the major water source for the Delta. So what would happen if that plan succeeds, and if those tunnels are used the way they're designed, is that the Delta would fill up with salt water from the ocean.
A disaster.
It would be an economic disaster for our communities. It would be an environmental disaster. Many species would go extinct. The fishing on the coast would be devastated. Farmers would be devastated.
Would that happen as a result of a natural disaster where the seawater would come rushing into the Delta?
Well, that's a good point. And what I'd like to say is that if they put the tunnels in, our fear is that they would ignore the risk to the Delta from the levee, the aging levees. And so it's very important, no matter what happens, to take care of the levees, to strengthen the levees, to re-engineer the levees so that they are going to be there. Because if they break, we have potential of Stockton flooding, potential of Modesto flooding, potential of Sacramento flooding. It would be a disaster much larger than Hurricane Katrina.
Now, what's interesting is a lot of Californians get confused between the Delta plan and the water bond, which is a completely separate issue going to the voters maybe in November 2014. That is supposed to address the issue of the levees. But again, we don't know if there's going to be a bill that gets out into an initiative that will be presented to the voters. So there's so much going on. Where do we go from here as a result?
Well, I think the thing to think about is back initially when the Bay Delta Conservation Plan was begun, there were 2 competing and equal goals. One is reliability of water shipments, and the other is the health of the Delta. Now, if you look at those 2 requirements, by reliability, you mean that as the same amount of water can be shipped no matter what conditions are occurring on the surface. In other words, is it a dry year or a wet year? Then if you're going to require the same amount of water under any conditions, then the health of the Delta cannot withstand that.
Okay, let's continue this conversation. For our viewers on HLN, we thank you for joining us. For our other viewers, we'll be right back. Congressman, you talk about wet and dry years, and as you know, we are in a dry year right now. In California, the snowpack is lower than it's been since possibly the 19th century. It's amongst the driest era that we've seen in decades. The snowpack about 52% normal. Why is this happening, sir? What is your sense of why we're facing these droughts?
Well, we have natural cycles of drought and wet years. The arching concern is if climate change is contributing to or will continue to contribute to drier years, to more severe droughts. And if that's the case, then we have to think very carefully, because there's only a finite amount of water in California. There's a tremendous demand for that water. And if we work together, I think we can find ways to store water in wet years, so that when we have dry years, there's enough water to go around.
I want to ask you about climate change. If we were speaking 5 years ago, I think I would be speaking with you about the tremendous skepticism behind climate change. Today, it seems as if that skepticism may have waned, even amongst those that were skeptics, many members of Congress, often part of the Republican Party. Is my perception accurate?
There is more acceptance in all areas of Congress now that global warming is a concern, that is something that we need to talk about and we need to deal with. I think on the Republican side, there's less urgency, the members feel less urgency to deal with that problem directly, perhaps than on the Democratic side.
So where do we go from here? Because in California, I think, look, we're on the left coast, and I think it's fair to say there is this sense that we need to do something immediately. We have our carbon trading system, which is often lampooned, but that being said, California can only do so much. You know, this is a national issue for those that are most concerned about global climate change.
Well, if we move forward aggressively in California, what's going to happen is that we're going to develop the technology, we're going to develop the techniques that the rest of the country is going to have to adopt sooner or later, one way or another. And that means that we will have the expertise, we will have the engineering, we will have the manufacturing in California, creating those jobs here. So not only is it an emergency in terms of, is it urgent in terms of our need for the benefit of the Earth's environment, but also we can get ahead of this thing in California, be leaders, and create a lot of technology and a lot of jobs.
Are you concerned that that time has passed? A lot of people feel as if we're done. I mean, we should have done something 10 years ago, 15 years ago. Or is there hope to avoid this impending, I don't want to sound, hyperbolic, but the impending doom, to avoid the impending doom?
Well, if we take that defeatist attitude, we'll certainly be in trouble. And so I don't think that that's the best course. But developing technology is what California does best. Let's let our engineers, let's let our venture capitalists, let's let them loose on this thing.
And let's talk about California and venture capital. Number one in the nation. Challenge becomes, do we have enough STEM engineers, STEM scientists, science, technology, education, math experts, engineering experts, I should say. That's caught up in an immigration reform discussion. Where do we go to try to build our STEM leaders of the future?
Well, we need more STEM education. There's no question, which means federal resources, and it means state resources, and it means getting people excited, getting young people in school excited about what that means in terms of how fun science is, how exciting engineering can be, and also the profitability, the personal reward, both in terms of gain, of being on the forefront of technology and making money to doing that.
I have to admit I have a bit of a bias. I have two daughters, 5th and 3rd grade. They like science, but I'm concerned that as they march forward, they won't be steered to science. There's something about STEM that can scare girls. Well, I know you'll disabuse me of that notion.
Maybe there is, and I think there was when I was in school. But now, just last night, I went to a display by the National Science Foundation, and many of the top presenters were women. It was very impressive. Young women who have just graduated. So that sort of stigma, or what do you want to call it, is disappearing.
Promise.
And women are graduating at the same level as men from college. And I see in colleges, in engineering fields, probably a little bit less than in science.
Isn't that right?
That's right. I'm a mathematician.
I remember that.
That doesn't mean we can let our guard down. That means we still need to encourage young women to get into these fields.
He is Jerry McNerney, a member of the U.S. Congress representing the Delta. My name is Brad Pomerance. You've been watching California Edition. Welcome. My name is Brad Pomerance. We are coming to you from the nation's capital in Washington, D.C. We are joining you from the Cannon House office building. Our guest today is Marsha Blackburn. She's a member of the United States Congress, representing significant portions of the great state of Tennessee. Thank you so much for joining us.
Good to be with you. Thank you, and welcome.
Thank you so much.
We're glad you're here.
We appreciate that. I want to speak with you about your constituents and what they are saying about the upcoming changes to health care. We know the Affordable Care Act is coming due in the beginning of 2014. What are their hopes, their fears, their concerns?
Well, when we're out doing our meetings, our town hall meetings, speaking to Rotary clubs and civic clubs, things of that nature, one of the things that probably they resent the most about the Obamacare is the overreach and the fact that supposedly insurance costs were going down. On average, insurance costs have gone up about $3,000 a family. They're looking at their annual insurance rates going up. You know, it's interesting that for your younger population, your 21 to 30-year-old, they're looking at 145% increases. So people are concerned about that. They're concerned about losing the ability to give health insurance benefits to their employees. They're looking at these new mandates. A manufacturing company in my area said, look, you know, we've got 55 employees. So what are we going to do? We're not going to hire when people retire, and then we're going to have
50.
Going to get below 50, and then new hires will be below 30 hours.
And let's talk about that, because I've heard that before, where we have small businesses or businesses that would like to at least give healthcare, be it over or under 50, and what they're thinking is, I'm going to cap my part-timers at 29 hours. Now, in some states, though, those individuals can turn to what we know as exchanges, run by their states. California, as an example, is adopting an exchange. What's happening in Tennessee? What has Tennessee decided to do?
Well, Tennessee learned by being the test case for Hillary Care with a program called TennCare that there is no way to incentivize the use of health care and be able to lower the cost and manage those costs. And thank goodness we have a governor that came in and reformed our program, and unfortunately California kept going the way of expanding and doing bigger. Tennessee's been a little smarter than that. And what we are not going to have are the state-based exchanges, and you're not going to see a Medicaid expansion, because we learned through the TennCare experience that when you incentivize that use, when you think you're going to do all this upfront investment and then reap all these savings on the back end, it never happens. The TennCare budget quadrupled in size within a 5-year period of time.
So will the federal government set up an exchange in Tennessee?
31 states have decided that they're not doing the exchanges, so therefore they will be federal exchanges. And this is all an issue that we'll have some oversight of there at Energy and Commerce Committee.
Which is what you're on. I do also ask you about the Medicaid expansion.
Sure.
As we know, the U.S. Supreme Court said that the federal government could not require states to accept the expansion. And so some states are. They will be getting 100% of that expansion covered for 4 or 5 years, then it drops to 90%.
3 years, yes.
Yeah, thank you. And Tennessee is not accepting that. What was the thinking? Because we do know some red states, if I can put that in quotes, they are in the end accepting the expansion because it's hard to deny that 100% coverage will come.
Oh, I know. The federal government comes with that candy to get you hooked. And I think the legislators in Tennessee, and by the way, Tennessee has a balanced budget amendment for our state. So I think that that is so very constructive when you look at debates that turn into not just the here and now, not just the next election, but legislators who are very thoughtful and say, let's look at it for the long term. Well, after that money goes away with that initial period, how are you going to handle this expanded Medicaid population?
But under the plan as it's written today, the decrease in federal expenditures will be 10%. So states will get 90% of that coverage.
That is the estimation of what it is at this time. But bear in mind, there are a lot of figures that are way off in Obamacare, and you have to ask, where's the money going to come from? The program was to be an $800 billion a year program, or $800 billion over 10 years. That was to be the cost estimate when the program was passed. They said, oh, it won't be $1 trillion.
Sure.
Then within 6 months, OMB came back to us and said, no, it's going to be a $1.4 trillion program. And this year, when we were building the budget, guess what the cost estimate was?
It went up, I presume.
$2.6 trillion.
But let
So
me-
yeah, it's doing the same thing TennCare did.
What do we do, what will Tennessee do with those individuals that are uninsured? They could have received Medicaid.
As I said, we lived through the experience of TennCare, and we have a reformed program that is in place that is doing a better job of meeting the needs. And I have to tell you, it's amazing. It doesn't matter. There's never going to be a time where you can get everybody to have insurance. Look at the states that have guaranteed issue. Look at the states that have community rating. There's no one that's been able to get 100% of the population insured, for the hospitals to completely do away with their indigent care numbers. All of those still run about 10 to 14%. So
But you're confident that through TennCare, even though Tennessee will not accept the
I am
expansion?
confident that our state legislators are going to find a way and continue finding ways to solve problems without the federal government mandates.
I want to speak about the sequester as well.
Sure.
You have been out front on issues of budget, and I want to get a sense from you how you feel the sequester is moving forward. We know that when the sequester was about to kick off, there was these hue and cries, the sky's going to fall.
Yeah,
That
and it
hasn't,
didn't.
And it didn't, which is interesting because for those that are fearful of the sequester, the fact the sky didn't fall makes it hard to jumpstart the
Right.
conversation. So what's your sense of the sequester?
You know, it's so interesting out in our district. We hear from people who say, you know, isn't it amazing? The federal government is going to have to learn to do more with less. And they know that Washington does not have a spending problem, that they don't have a revenue problem.
Right.
They have a spending problem, to the point that, you know how much that they are borrowing every day here in Washington?
I know it's a high number. I hear-
$3 billion
Yeah, I know
a
it's a-
day. 40 cents of every dollar that is being spent. So people know that you can't continue to do that. And my constituents fully realize you can't continue to do that. You got to get it under control.
Are you concerned that the fashion in which the sequester was put into place, that the cuts aren't so much targeted, but it's just 8% off everything, 13% off defense? Or do you think that's appropriate?
A lot of it, I don't like the defense cuts, I will tell you that. But every year I have filed bills calling for 1%, 2%, and 5% across the board spending cuts.
Right.
Because it works. Our counties, our states, our governments, our many times companies do an across the board cut in order to bring a budget into balance. It requires everybody to be a good steward, to sit
Right.
down with a pencil and paper and figure out where they're going to make their cuts.
So
They work.
Where do we go as we move forward, looking at sequestration, looking at the upcoming debt ceiling debate, which actually may be postponed a bit because the economy seems to be doing better? Tax receipts are up. So what do you predict will happen on this issue?
Well, I think that what you're going to see happen is the American people are demanding that Washington get the spending under control. And now people realize they're looking at the debt clock every day.
Right.
And you're nearly $17 trillion in debt. The estimate is you're going to hit $25 trillion in debt.
You don't think we've turned around a bit on the debt issue?
No, I don't, because you're still borrowing at a rate of $3 billion a day, and what should concern you is who owns that debt. So
Who
our
owns it?
constituents are focused on this. Well, you know, of our publicly traded debt,
Right.
$1.2 trillion is owned by China, $1.1 trillion by Japan.
I knew the answer.
Number 3
I knew
on
the
the
answer.
list is
Right.
OPEC, the cartel. And we're spending billions of dollars with them. You know, the American people are smart. They're wise to what's going on. My constituents are paying attention to this, and they're saying, look, Washington has a spending problem. The spending needs to stop. A lot of waste out there. We've cut our budget. Our companies cut the budget. Get with it.
Her
Make
name
some
is
cuts.
Marsha Blackburn. She's a member of the U.S. Congress from Tennessee. My name is Brad Pomerance. Thank you for watching.